Joining me now is Isabel Oakeshott, TalkTV's international editor and writer of the Lockdown Files and a whistleblower. Isabel, welcome to the show. We've seen the Prime Minister already push today about these text messages, these messages that are alleged to have disappeared both from his phone, Boris Johnson's phone, and other senior people in the government. Your whistleblowing book, The Lockdown Files, dealt with lots of these text messages produced by Matt Hancock to enable you to write that book. Do you think the public buys the idea that all of these messages are just now lost from history?
Well, I have some of Rishi Sunak's WhatsApp messages from the critical period. And what I can say is that the evidence I have is that he is telling the truth when he says he didn't use it very much. You know, he was pretty sparing in his interactions by WhatsApp, certainly with Matt Hancock, the then health secretary. I've only got a few sort of pages of WhatsApps between them, contrast with scores of pages with certain other cabinet ministers at the time. And I was struck when I first read Rishi Sunak's messages by how cautious he was, actually, you know, very, very circumspect in what he put in writing. And we've actually heard that from the COVID inquiry this morning, where he's talked about not being much of a prolific WhatsApp user. And there was also an interesting debate about an article that appeared actually in the Spectator magazine sometime into the pandemic, where he talked about, you know, he was quoted in that article. It might have been an unattributed, but anyway, words to the effect of, you know, that he doesn't always put things in writing. And he was sort of challenged on that in the session this morning, and he managed to back that off. I'm struck by his evidence this morning, by just how conciliatory he's been all the way through. Time and again, he's been offered the opportunity to criticise Boris Johnson's operation, to criticise the dysfunction in Downing Street, to criticise the way meetings were structured, to criticise the way decisions were taken. Time and again, he's not done so, very deliberately not done so. The key phrases that he's used all morning are, you know, I think that was absolutely right and proper. There's nothing inappropriate about that. You'd expect that to happen, wouldn't you? So certainly Boris Johnson owes him a nice festive drink. Not that I'm sure there's very much love lost between them, but he's really gone out of his way not to criticise anyone so far.
But Isabel, does that speak to his view or not on the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, or is that an acknowledgement by Rishi Sunak that he effectively owns at least half of the actions that were taken during the COVID pandemic? Do you think he's nervous about, you know, his own legacy and how people will view him in relation to some of the decisions he made?
Well, I think that's a perfectly reasonable observation. You know, I wouldn't say that he owns half of it, because actually the Chancellor probably doesn't have 50% of the power in an administration, and certainly not in a crisis like this. But if we wanted to put a figure on it, it might be 40-60 in favour of the Prime Minister. But I also think it's a reflection of Rishi Sunak's personality. You know, publicly at least, he's always been very careful. He's not a briefer. He doesn't snipe. He doesn't carp. He's not a plotter in the way that some others are. When I helped write a biography of Rishi Sunak, the first and only biography at the time, he was Chancellor at that point. It was during the pandemic. I was struck then by how difficult it was to find anyone with a bad word to say about him. Now, fast forward to now, and I'm sure there'll be many more people who are prepared to criticise Rishi Sunak. But he is, you know, his whole style is managerial. You know, he's not somebody that goes out seeking division or fueling it. And I think we've seen that in his evidence session this morning.
But he is going to be pushed, isn't he, on some of the decisions he made, particularly around, we hear, Eat Out to Help Out. As he arrived this morning, he was heckled by the bereaved families who shouted, "Meet, eat and die" at the Prime Minister. I think a specific reference to that second peak we saw after Eat Out to Help Out. you think the Prime Minister's going to come out fighting, really, to say why it was right
Well,
for the
and
UK
so
economy
he
that we did
should.
that?
And so he should. I think that the bereaved here are behaving very badly. I don't think that just because they lost loved ones, for which our heart can always go out to anyone who lost loved ones during the pandemic, that gives them the entitlement to behave as they please and to heckle and interrupt and accuse any of the key players of, in quotes, killing their relatives. I mean, there was somebody outside the COVID inquiry last week when Boris Johnson was giving evidence who carried a placard saying, Boris Johnson killed my husband. I mean, this is appalling behaviour. The relatives have been put at the heart of the COVID inquiry, and the COVID inquiry is going to great lengths to listen to them. They ought to show the COVID inquiry the respect it's due and listen to the evidence that's being given by the key witnesses. And Rishi Sunak will defend his Eat Out and Help Out scheme, and quite rightly so, because the evidence does not show that it was in fact responsible for a huge surge in infections. It may
Isabel,
be.
you are quite right, because there was a similar peak in France, which didn't have a Eat Out to Help Out scheme, and it occurred about the same sort of time. Do you think we'll see the Prime Minister pressed on things like furlough and the Bounceback Loans? Of course, Lord Agnew very stylishly and famously resigned at the dispatch box in the House of Lords after a £4.3 billion loss was put down to fraudulent claims of the Bounceback Loans. Do you think some of those decisions, which sat squarely in the Treasury, where hundreds of millions and in fact billions of pounds have been lost, will be something we see the Prime Minister pushed on?
Well, this is much more interesting territory, I believe, and there's so much more of a case to answer there on the enormous scale of fraud in COVID loans and support schemes. That absolutely should be scrutinised, and Rishi Sunak must be called to answer questions about that, again, on the way contracts were run. And lots of people have really, really strong feelings about that on the massive multi-million pound procurement contract. So I hope that we hear an awful lot more of that and an awful lot less fixation with Eat Out to Help Out, which just because it has a gimmicky name doesn't mean that it's somehow responsible for all of the evils of the pandemic. On the contrary, that just does not withstand scrutiny.
And finally, just to pick up on your point, I mean, the whole point about this inquiry is to get Britain in a better state of preparedness and readiness. It isn't meant to be a sort of political trial of those people who were making the decisions at the time. But there is going to be this big question, you pick up on it, about these PPE contracts. And that really does speak to the readiness and the preparedness of our country, the United Kingdom, for not just the last, but any future pandemic. He's not going to want to, as Prime Minister and Chancellor at the time of this pandemic, to really get into the weeds of that, because if you believe what's written in the press and widely reported online and talked about in people's homes up and down this country, those PPE contracts delivered through the fast lane are not going to show the Prime Minister as Chancellor or anyone else in the government at the time in a good light.
Well, what he will say is what Matt Hancock also has said time and again, which was that this wasn't up to him. You know, this is the work of civil servants. You can't have the Chancellor or the Health Secretary or indeed the Prime Minister personally overseeing multi-million pound contracts. There are processes, and the question is whether or not these processes were followed, or whether anybody who was friends with people in high places got some kind of preferential treatment. I think it's quite obvious to everybody that in the absolute panic of the early days of the pandemic, the government grossly overpaid for what was often quite inadequate PPE. Lots of it turned out to be frankly useless. Whether that's somehow Rishi Sunak's personal fault, I really doubt, actually. It may be that the person who should be giving, or the person or people who should be giving evidence on that front, are actually the particular civil servants who were involved in signing off those contracts. I can't believe for a minute that
Well,
Rishi Sunak.
I suppose people would say it's not actually how government works, but people at home would say, well, you know, the Chancellor of the Exchequer signed the cheques, although, of course, no cheques were signed, I'm sure. The other thing, you say you'd like to see senior civil servants brought before this inquiry. Do you also think the fact that the Labour Party and all opposition parties really just supported the government on lockdowns and all these sort of things that they did, that there is an argument to get senior political leaders like Keir Starmer and others in front of this inquiry, because arguably you could say there was a failure of opposition during COVID as we all sort of merrily sort of went the same way through the division lobbies of the House of Commons, voting through these things like lockdowns, which have ultimately turned out to be very beneficial in some ways, but also very damaging, particularly to young people who are unable to attend school.
Did you merrily go through those voting lobbies?
No, I didn't go through for all of them. I just, as I was saying it, I was trying to recall, I definitely was not in support of the tiering system, because the poor people of Bolton, in the historic county of Lancashire, now in Greater Manchester, had 18 set of COVID restrictions on them in less than a month. And Isabel, if you have all of Matt Hancock's text messages, I only sent Matt Hancock one text message during that period. I don't know if it's in your lockdown files, but it basically was saying to him, this tiering system in the north of England is insanity. Now, it didn't quite put it that politely, so if you do have it, please don't publish it.
Yeah, I think I might actually. I think I might actually have that one.
Well, we'll just keep that between us, though.
Yeah, well, look, you make a really important point, which is about the failure of opposition at that time. And that's something that I think many of those who feel that lockdowns were ruinous and are still suffering from the effects of them will also care about. Why was there not more questioning of these policies? Why did enormously seismic legislation effectively go through on the nod? And it would be, I think, of value to hear from the Labour leadership as to why they, if anything, just pushed ever harder for more lockdown restrictions, or otherwise just blithely went along with it. But I think in defence of you and your colleagues, often you weren't given the opportunity actually to make much of an objection or put down much of a marker against any of what was happening. There was an unprecedented concentration of power at the top, and even those in cabinet were effectively frozen out. We've heard that from, for example, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's spoken very powerfully about that. So ordinary backbenchers or junior ministers didn't really have that much of a framework in which to put an alternative viewpoint. I regret that more weren't braver in speaking out, but I do know how very difficult it was to do so.
Isabel, thank you for joining us here live on Talk TV.